I thought I was the guest of honor at the Easter brunch I had paid for, until my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and said there was no seat for me today. She blamed the crowded restaurant, but I saw the truth. To them, I was already dead. Just a walking bank account worth $7.5 million waiting to be divided. They thought I was helpless, but they forgot that I learned to survive before they were even born. My name is Eleanor Hartley, and at 62 years of age, I am fully aware of how the world sees a widow in Brookhaven. They see the pearls, the manicured garden, and the quiet existence of a retiree. What they fail to see is the woman who built Silverline Facility Group from a bucket of soapy water into a commercial cleaning empire that spanned 3 states. I sold that business a few years ago for a sum that would make most people choke on their morning coffee. But I never flaunted the numbers. I assumed my legacy was safe, and I assumed my place at the head of the table was earned. That assumption died this morning. My son, Mark, had picked me up in his polished SUV, humming along to the radio while I clutched my purse in the passenger seat. I felt a swell of pride because this brunch at the Gilded Oak was my treat. Mark had suggested the venue, hinting at the steep deposit required for a holiday booking, and I had happily handed over my credit card information days ago. I thought I was the guest of honor, the matriarch being celebrated on Easter Sunday. When we walked into the restaurant, the noise of clinking silverware and laughter washed over us. I spotted our table near the window, bathed in soft spring light. My daughter-in-law, Savannah, was already seated, laughing at something a woman next to her had said. My grandchildren, Owen and Mia, were tapping on their tablets. But as we approached, my steps faltered. The round table was completely full. Mark's friends were there, occupying the remaining chairs. I stopped, my hand tightening on the handle of my cane. I looked at Mark, then at the table, expecting someone to jump up and fetch a manager to pull up an extra chair. Savannah looked up, her smile tightening into something that did not reach her eyes. "Oh, you're here," she said, her voice bright and brittle. She glanced around the crowded dining room and shrugged. "No seat for you today. It was too last minute, and the place is packed." I blinked, trying to process the dismissal. "But I paid the deposit," I said, my voice lower than I intended. "It's just a seating chart mix-up." "Eleanor," Savannah said, waving a manicured hand dismissively, "why don't you grab a seat at the bar or—" "Honestly, you could just take an Uber back to the house and rest. It's going to be so loud in here for you anyway." I stood frozen. The humiliation was a physical heat rising up my neck. I watched Savannah lean toward her friend, lowering her voice just enough that she thought I could not hear. But I heard every syllable. "She eats so slow, and that wheelchair just blocks the aisle," Savannah whispered, rolling her eyes. "It makes everyone uncomfortable." I felt the blood drain from my face. I have never used a wheelchair in my life. I use a cane because of a slight hip issue, a souvenir from years of scrubbing floors on my hands and knees to pay for Mark's private school tuition. I looked at Mark, waiting for him to defend me, waiting for him to tell his wife to show some respect. Instead, he looked pained, digging into his pocket and pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. "Mum, look." "I'm sorry," Mark said, avoiding my eyes. He pressed the paper into my palm. It was a voucher for a free coffee at a chain down the street. "Just go get a latte on me." "Okay, we'll catch up later." He turned his back on me and sat down in the only empty spot left, right next to his wife. I stood there for a moment, a ghost in my own life, clutching a voucher worth maybe $5 in the same hand that had signed the check for this entire meal. I turned and walked toward the exit, my cane clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. I needed air. I stepped outside onto the patio, but the large glass windows of the restaurant offered no privacy. I stopped near an open ventilation window, trying to steady my breathing. That was when I heard Mark's voice drift out, clear and careless. "I feel kind of bad." "Mark," one of his friends said. "Let it go," Mark replied, his mouth full of food. "In a few years, once we split the 7.5 million of moms, well, then I can invite whoever I want to brunch. Until then, we just deal with her." The sentence hung in the air like smoke. $7.5 million. They had the number memorized. They had clearly done the math on my life expectancy. I stood there, staring through the glass. I watched Savannah throw her head back in laughter. I watched Mark toast with a mimosa I had paid for. The sharp pain in my chest was not a heart attack. It was the severing of a cord. I did not cry. Crying is for people who are helpless. And as I watched them feast on my generosity while erasing my presence, I realized I was far from helpless. I smoothed the front of my coat and gripped my cane. "If today they think there is no seat for me," I whispered to the cold glass, "then I will just have to move the whole damn table." The silence of my Brookhaven home hit me harder than the humiliation at the restaurant. After the taxi dropped me off, I sat in my wingback chair, the leather cool against my skin, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. This house used to vibrate with life Ben's heavy footsteps, Mark's childhood laughter, the chaotic joy of holiday dinners. Now, it was just a museum of memories where I was the sole exhibit, collecting dust in the dark. It happened around 9 that evening. A sudden wave of vertigo sent me stumbling into the granite island in the kitchen. I went down hard, bruising my hip against the tile. It was painful, shocking more than anything. But I was fully conscious. I called Mark. He and Savannah arrived nearly an hour later, blaming traffic on a Sunday night. But their eyes were not filled with the panic or concern of children worried about a parent. They were filled with calculation. "Mum, this is a sign," Mark said, pacing my kitchen while I held an ice pack to my hip. "You can't live here alone anymore. It's irresponsible." The emergency room doctor had suggested physical therapy and rest, explicitly stating that I could recover perfectly fine at home with a visiting nurse. Mark, however, was hearing none of it. He spoke over me, his voice taking on that patronizing tone men use when they think they are managing a difficult child. "We are moving you to Cedar Grove Transitional Care," he declared, his hands on his hips. "Just for a few weeks. They have professionals. Mum, we can't be worrying about you falling and dying alone on the kitchen floor." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a mandate. While Mark managed the logistics, Savannah was busy organizing. I watched from the stretcher as she swept my mail, my checkbook, my passport, and the contents of my wall safe into a large tote bag. "I'm just going to hold on to these so they don't get lost while you're in transition." "Eleanor," she said, flashing that tight, practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "We will handle the bills. You just focus on getting better." It felt less like help and more like a seizure of assets. The drive to Cedar Grove was suffocating. Mark tapped the steering wheel, glancing at the passing houses of our affluent neighborhood. "You know, The market is at an absolute peak right now, he said, trying to sound casual, though the greed in his voice was unmistakable. If we listed your place today, we could probably get at least 1.2 million, maybe more. You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or taxes ever again. He didn't sound like a son worried about his mother's hip. He sounded like a broker closing a deal. Cedar Grove was clean, sterile, and smelled of antiseptic and old lavender. Within an hour, I was tagged as a fall risk and put on a regimented schedule. Breakfast at 7, pills at 8, lights out at 9. My autonomy was stripped away layer by layer. Mark visited exactly once. A 10-minute stop where he checked his watch 3 times before delegating his duties to brief, infrequent phone calls that felt more like business check-ins than family connections. It was Rosa Martinez, the head nurse, who finally cracked the facade. She was efficient but kind, the first person in days to look me in the eye as a human being rather than a patient number. She asked about my favorite music while adjusting my IV, treating me with a dignity I had almost forgotten. "Your son calls a lot," she mentioned one afternoon, keeping her voice low as she checked my chart. "But he mostly asks about the insurance coverage and the power of attorney paperwork. He rarely asks how your hip is actually healing." A cold dread settled in my stomach. "Rosa, could you hand me my purse from the locker?" I asked. She obliged. I dug through the leather bag with trembling hands. My phone was there. My wallet was there. But the heavy brass keyring, the one holding the keys to the house I had bought with my own sweat and tears, was gone. I lay back against the stiff hospital pillow, listening to the canned laughter from a television in the next room and the squeak of rubber shoes in the hallway. I closed my eyes and let the pieces fall into place. "No seat for you?" Savannah had said. Then the rush to move me here, the talk of selling the house for over $1 million, and now, the missing keys. This wasn't a series of unfortunate events or a son's overprotective concern. It was an eviction. Someone had locked the door to my life without asking, and they had no intention of ever letting me back in. Cedar Grove Transitional Care operated with the mechanical efficiency of a factory designed to process human inventory. My life shrank to a rigid loop of indignities, starting at 6 in the morning with a blood pressure cuff squeezing my arm, followed by a tray of lukewarm eggs at 7, and physical therapy at 9. By the afternoon, the staff wheeled us into the common room to watch game shows. I sat there, surrounded by slumped figures in wheelchairs, watching the flickering screen, while canned applause filled the silence of our abandonment. I began to observe the others with the clarity of someone who knows she is looking at her own potential future. There was Mrs. Gable, a woman down the hall who sat by the window every Sunday in her best blouse, waiting for a daughter who never came. Instead, a delivery boy would drop off a generic fruit basket at the front desk. There was Mr. Henderson, whose son had dropped him off 3 months ago and had not returned to sign the renewal papers. We were not people here. We were expired goods waiting to be cleared from the shelf. One morning, while I was gripping the parallel bars in the therapy gym, trying to force my stiff hip to cooperate, Rosa Martinez stood beside me. She adjusted my gait belt, her voice barely a whisper. "Your son called again this morning," Rosa said, keeping her eyes on my feet. "Did he ask when I can come home?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Rosa hesitated, looking around to ensure no one was listening. "No. He asked if the new medication makes you drowsy. He asked..." Specifically, if you were lucid enough to understand legal documents and if your handwriting was steady. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning ran down my spine. Thank you. Rosa, I said. My voice was steady, but my grip on the bars tightened until my knuckles turned white. Back in my room, I asked Rosa to close the door and hand me my phone. My fingers flew across the screen, accessing my banking app. It took me 3 tries to get the password right because my hands were shaking with rage. There it was. A notification I had missed during the chaos of the move. Mark had used his power of attorney to add his name to my primary checking account. I scrolled down the transaction history. A transfer of $500 for administrative costs. Another for $2,000 labeled medical retainer. He was siphoning my liquidity under the guise of caring for me. I dialed the number for Harlan Pierce, the family lawyer who had handled my affairs for 20 years. Harlan's office, the receptionist answered. "This is Eleanor Hartley," I said, cutting through the pleasantries. "I want to know if anyone has requested access to my estate planning file recently." There was a long pause on the other end, the sound of typing, and then a nervous clear of the throat. "Well, Mrs. Hartley, Mark called last week. Since he is your primary beneficiary and holds power of attorney, he requested a certified copy of your current will. We sent it over on Tuesday." I ended the call without saying goodbye. The phone felt heavy in my hand, like a stone. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a confirmed timeline. In their eyes, I was no longer the mother who had worked 16 hours a day to pay for Mark's college. I was an asset to be liquidated. I was a vault they were trying to crack open before the timer ran out. That night, sleep was impossible. The facility was filled with the sounds of the dying and the forgotten, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, the distant moans of a patient in pain, the hum of machinery keeping people alive who no longer had anyone to live for. I stared at the acoustic tiles of the ceiling and replayed the moment at the restaurant. In a few years, once we split the money, they were not waiting for me to die naturally. They were actively accelerating the process of erasing me. The door creaked open. It was Rosa, doing her midnight rounds. She saw the light from the street lamp hitting my open eyes. "Mrs. Hartley," she whispered. "Are you in pain?" I turned my head to look at her. My mind was clearer than it had been in years. The fog of shock had lifted, replaced by a cold, sharp determination. "I need a lawyer," I said, my voice cutting through the dark room. "And I need one who does not know my son." Rosa looked at me for a long moment, assessing the steel in my gaze. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a small, wrinkled business card. She pressed it into my hand. "This is Amara Delgado," Rosa said softly. "She is a friend of my sister. She hates bullies." She gave me a curt nod. "If you want to change the story, you start by making this call." I lay in the dark at Cedar Grove, listening to the radiator hiss, and my mind drifted back to the beginning. Not the beginning. Mark likes to tell people about the one where we were a comfortable middle-class family with a safety net. I went back to the real beginning, the one that started the day Ben died. I was 34 years old. Mark was 10. When Ben was crushed in that warehouse accident, he did not leave me a fortune. He left me a grief that felt like a physical weight, a confused little boy, and a mountain of credit card debt. The neighbors whispered that I must have received a massive insurance payout. They were wrong. The company fought the claim, and I was too exhausted to sue. Instead, I took a small, predatory loan to buy 3 industrial vacuums and a van that smelled of stale cigarettes. I registered the business as Silverline Facility Group. It sounded professional, prestigious even. In reality, it was just me, desperate to ensure the electricity did not get cut off in the winter. I worked the graveyard shift. I remember dragging Mark along because I could not afford a babysitter, and I was terrified to leave him alone in the house. He would sleep on a hard plastic chair in the lobby of the medical center while I scrubbed the floors. I can still smell the bleach. I can still feel the ache in my lower back from hauling trash bags that weighed as much as I did. One night, my main vacuum shorted out. I sat on the linoleum floor, crying, trying to strip a wire with a dull kitchen knife because I did not have the $50 for a repairman. Mark woke up, rubbed his eyes, and asked, "Mom, are we going home soon?" I wiped my face with my sleeve, smiled at him, and lied. "Soon. Honey, I just have to fix this magic machine first." I fixed it with duct tape and sheer will. That was how Silverline was built. It was not built on investment strategies. It was built on my knees. By the time Mark was in high school, I had 3 crews. By the time he was in college, I had a fleet of trucks. I drove those trucks myself to bid on contracts. Mark likes to brag to his friends now about the skyscrapers downtown, saying his parents own shares in the management companies. He does not know that I know the service elevators of those buildings better than the CEOs know their own boardrooms. I shielded him from the sweat. That was my error. I let him believe that stability was a natural state, not something you fight for every single day. When I sold Silverline to Northpath Integrated Solutions at the age of 58, the check was for over $7.5 million. I stared at that number and felt only relief. I did not buy a yacht. I did not buy a summer home in France. I told Mark, "This is enough for me to live on, and to help the family if you ever need it." I made the money too accessible. That was the second error. When Mark and Savannah bought their first house, I paid the deposit. When Owen needed private preschool tuition, I wrote the check. When they wanted to take the kids to Disney World but were a little tight, I funded the trip. "You're the best, Mom," Mark had said, hugging me at the airport. "I swear. I'll pay you back by taking care of you when you're old. You won't have to lift a finger." I believed him. I believed him so much that a year after the sale, when he suggested I move my investment portfolio to a financial advisor who was his good friend, I agreed. He said it was to optimize my returns. Now I realize it was so he could see every transaction. It was surveillance disguised as assistance. Lying there in that hospital bed, the bitterness finally choked out the sadness. I realized that my years of labor, the nights I spent inhaling chemical fumes so he could sleep in a warm bed, had not raised a son who loved me. They had raised a man who looked at his mother and saw only a broken ATM. I had become a machine that was printing money too slowly for his taste, and he had decided it was time to sell me for scrap. The next morning, I waited until the hallway was quiet before using the landline in my room. I did not trust my cell phone anymore, not since I realized Mark was monitoring the data usage. I dialed the number on the card Rosa had given me. Law Office of Amara Delgado. A crisp voice answered. "My name is Eleanor Hartley," I said, keeping my voice low. "I need a consultation immediately. My family cannot know. If anyone asks, you are here to verify my long-term care insurance details." Amara arrived 2 hours later. She was 35, with sharp eyes and a slim briefcase that looked more like a weapon than an accessory. She did not speak to me with the pitying tone everyone else at Cedar Grove used. She sat down, opened a notebook, and looked at me like I was a CEO chairing a board meeting. "Start from the beginning," she said, "and do not leave out the money." I told her everything. I told her about Silverline, the sale to Northpath, the $7.5 million, and the slow erosion of my control. I told her about the keys, the blocked access to my house, and finally, the brunch. "They didn't just forget a chair," I said, my voice hardening. They looked at me and decided I was already gone. When Savannah said, "No seat for you today," she wasn't talking about the restaurant. She was talking about my life. Amara tapped her pen against the paper. "Here is the reality, Mrs. Hartley. If Mark can build a medical file suggesting cognitive decline following your fall, he will petition the court for emergency guardianship. Once he has that, he moves your assets into a protected account under his control. He will sell your house, put you in a cheaper facility, and pay himself a salary to manage your money." I felt a cold rage settle in my chest. "Not if I move first." "Exactly," Amara said. We spent the next hour drafting the architecture of my revenge. It was not violent, it was administrative. I instructed Amara to draft a revocable living trust and a new will. Mark and Savannah were to be explicitly disinherited. I set aside a modest educational trust for my grandchildren, Owen and Mia. But it was locked tight. They could only access it upon turning 25, and only if they completed a financial literacy course. Their parents could not touch a cent of it. "The bulk of the estate," I said, looking out the window at the parking lot where Mark had abandoned me, "will go to establish the Hartley Resilience Foundation. I want to fund legal aid and housing for older women who have been financially abused by their families." Amara smiled, a genuine, sharp expression. "I like it. But we need armor. Mark will challenge this. He will say you were medicated, confused, or coerced. Record it." I said. Amara pulled out a digital recorder. We also arranged for 2 independent neurologists to visit me the next day under the guise of post-fall evaluations. They would certify my capacity. Rosa agreed to sign an affidavit stating that in all our conversations, I had been lucid, sharp, and fully aware of my financial history. 2 days later, I was granted a pass for an off-site medical appointment. Rosa drove me, but we did not go to a doctor. We met Amara at the downtown branch of my bank. I walked into that bank, not as a frail old woman, but as the founder of Silverline. I sat in the manager's office and systematically dismantled Mark's access. We transferred the liquid assets into the new trust accounts. I authorized the sale of the high-risk speculative investments Mark had purchased to help his friend's startup. I watched the manager type the commands that severed my son's digital leash on my life. "It's done," the manager said, handing me the receipt. "Thank you," I replied. "And please, remove my son's phone number from the alert list. He doesn't need to be bothered with my finances anymore." On the ride back to Cedar Grove, I held the thick envelope containing the copies of my new trust and the filed will. I looked out the window at the passing trees. For weeks, I had felt like a wounded animal waiting for the hunter to finish me off. But as I clutched that envelope, the fear evaporated. "You okay?" Mrs. Hartley Rosa asked from the driver's seat. I looked at her in the rearview mirror and smiled. "I am better than okay. Rosa, for the first time since Easter, I am not the prey. I am the one designing the game. My recovery was progressing faster than anyone expected, certainly faster than Mark wanted. When the doctor suggested transferring me to a long-term nursing facility, I countered with a request to visit my home for a few days to assess my mobility in a familiar environment. Mark agreed, but his reluctance dripped through the phone line. "Fine. Mom," he said, his voice tight. "But you are strictly on the ground floor, no stairs. And please, do not answer the door or sign for any packages. I don't want you getting confused." He thought he was managing an invalid. He did not know he was granting access to an enemy combatant. Rosa drove me to the house in her battered sedan. She parked down the street to avoid alerting the neighbors. We walked up the driveway, and I bypassed the digital lock Mark had installed. I reached into the soil of the large fern planter by the door and dug out a small, tarnished brass key. I had hidden it there 10 years ago, long before I knew I would need to break into my own life. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt wrong. The scent of my vanilla candles and old books was gone, replaced by the chemical sting of fresh paint and industrial cleaner. I leaned heavily on my cane, my stomach churning. "Oh my God," Rosa whispered, looking around. My living room had been lobotomized. My comfortable, slightly worn velvet sofa was gone, replaced by a beige, sharp-edged sectional that looked like it belonged in a dentist's waiting room. The walls, once warm cream, were now a stark, trendy grey. The mantel, where I had kept 40 years of family photos, Mark's graduation, Ben's fishing trips, the grandkids' first steps, was bare. In their place stood 3 generic, abstract sculptures that meant absolutely nothing. They were staging the house. They were erasing me to make the square footage more palatable to a buyer. I walked to the master bedroom on the ground floor. It was worse here. The bed was stripped. Against the wall sat a row of cardboard boxes, aggressively labelled in black marker: donate, dump, estate, to review. I opened the box marked dump. Inside, I saw my favourite wool cardigan, the one Ben had bought me for our 10th anniversary. I saw my heavily annotated cookbooks. I saw the journals I had kept since I was 20. They were not packing my things. They were throwing away the evidence of my existence. "Mrs. Hartley," Rosa called out from the study. Her voice shook. I walked over. The mahogany desk was covered in papers. I picked up a loan application for a mortgage refinance on my property, with Mark listed as the primary contact. Next to it was a notepad with Savannah's handwriting. She had listed target listing price at $1.2 million, followed by a list of deductions, staging fees, landscaping, kitchen upgrade repayment. She was already spending the equity of a house that did not belong to her. Rosa handed me a single sheet of paper that had fallen under the chair. It was a printout of an email from Mark to Harlan Pierce. "Harlan, if Mom is deemed mentally incapacitated due to the fall, can we trigger the executor clause early? We need to move on the sale before the market cools in late May." I stared at the words, trigger the executor clause. It was a polite way of asking how to bury me legally while my heart was still beating. "Help me to the attic stairs." I told Rosa. Mark said no stairs. Rosa said, but she was already offering me her arm. We went up slowly. I did not care about the clothes or the jewellery. I went straight to the back corner and pulled out a battered plastic bin. Inside were the origins of Silverline. The first ledger I wrote by hand. The contract for the sale to Northpath. A black and white photo of the very first van I bought, with me standing next to it in coveralls, looking tired but ferocious. I handed the box to Rosa. This goes with us, I said. This is the only thing in this house that is real. Before we left, I went back to the box of photos they had shoved in the closet. I found one from the early days, me on my hands and knees, scrubbing a commercial floor, my hair tied back, sweat on my brow. It was gritty and unglamorous. It was the antithesis of the beige, staged lie they had turned my home into. I walked into the pristine living room and placed that photo right in the center of the empty mantel. It stood there like a stain, a reminder that this wealth came from dirt, and the woman who scrubbed that dirt was not done yet. As Rosa drove us away, I watched the house shrink in the side mirror. I felt a strange detachment. It was no longer the place where I had raised my son or mourned my husband. It was just an asset now. It was a weapon on a chessboard, and I was about to use it to checkmate the people who thought they could box me up and label me dump. 3 days after my secret excursion to the bank, a courier envelope arrived from the office of Harlan Pierce. It was marked urgent, a word Harlan usually reserved for tax audits, not estate planning. I opened it in the privacy of my room. The cover letter was a masterpiece of legal euphemism. It referenced a necessary update to the estate plan, initiated by my family representative, Mark Hartley, based on the assumption that I was imminently transitioning to a permanent nursing facility. I skipped to the attached draft. It was not a will. It was a robbery in progress. Mark's proposal was simple and brutal. My house was to be sold immediately. The proceeds, along with my investment accounts, were to be liquidated. 80% of the total assets would go directly to Mark. 10% would go into a college trust for Owen and Mia. The final 10%, a mere sliver of the fortune I had built, would be placed in a maintenance trust for my care, to be administered at the sole discretion of Mark Hartley. He was effectively paying himself a salary to keep me alive in the cheapest room he could find. I took a photo of the document and sent it to Amara with a single caption: "He thinks I am already dead." Amara called me 10 minutes later. We agreed on a strategy of silence. We would not send back a red-lined draft. We would not argue over the percentages. We would let Harlan and Mark believe that I was too passive, too medicated, or too broken to object. Meanwhile, the real will, the one that secured my legacy and stripped Mark of his, was already being filed through Amara's secure system, notarized by witnesses who were not on my son's payroll. The next morning, Amara fired the first warning shot. She sent a formal notice to Harlan Pierce, informing him that he no longer represented Eleanor Hartley and that all future communication regarding my assets must go through her office. It was a bureaucratic slap in the face, severing the direct line Mark thought he had to my checkbook. The reaction was immediate. My phone at the bedside remained unplugged. So Mark called the nurses' station. I could hear Rosa's voice from the hallway, calm and professional, answering what must have been a frantic barrage of questions. "Mr. Hartley, I cannot give you details on who your mother visits with," Rosa said, her tone unwavering. "But I can assure you she is completely lucid. She has the right to legal counsel. No, she is not confused. No, I will not stop her from making calls." An hour later, Mark and Savannah appeared in my doorway. They were out of breath, their faces flushed with a mixture of panic and forced concern. Mark held a folder that looked suspiciously like a power of attorney agreement. "Mom," Mark said, rushing to my bedside. "What is going on?" "Harlan called me. He said some random lawyer contacted him. You don't need a stranger involved. It's messy." Just sign this authorization so I can clear it up and pay your bills. The electricity at the house is due." I leaned back into the pillows, letting my eyelids droop. I forced a dry, rattling cough. "I'm just so tired today." "Mark," I whispered, keeping my hands firmly under the blanket. "My head feels heavy. Leave the papers. I'll look at them later." Savannah stepped forward, her voice high and tight. "Eleanor, it really needs to be done today. We're just trying to help you. Don't you trust us later?" I rasped, closing my eyes. "I need to sleep." They left defeated, leaving the folder on the nightstand. I waited until their footsteps faded down the hall before I sat up, my energy returning instantly. I picked up the folder and dropped it directly into the trash can. That afternoon, Amara confirmed that the Hartley Resilience Foundation was officially registered. The bank accounts were open. She had even drafted a press release exposing financial abuse in affluent families, ready to be sent to major news outlets if Mark tried to fight dirty in court. "Hold the press release," I told her. "I don't want to destroy him in the papers. I want to see his face when he realizes he did it to himself." Later that evening, while wheeling myself down the corridor for a change of scenery, I heard a familiar voice. Mark was standing near the vending machines, his back to me, talking loudly on his cell phone. He clearly thought I was asleep in my room. "Yeah, it's just a hiccup," Mark said, laughing nervously. "The old lawyer is just being difficult. Mum is, well, she's fading, honestly. She'll be in long-term care by next month. Once she's tucked away, the house goes on the market. The assets are basically mine already. It's just paperwork now." I stopped my wheelchair. The coldness in his voice was absolute. He wasn't talking about a mother. He was talking about an obstacle he had almost cleared. I reversed the wheels silently, backing away before he turned around. I went back to my room and called Amara. "Change the plan," I said. "I don't want you to just handle Harlan. I want a meeting. Tell Harlan we need a full review of the estate and the beneficiaries. Tell him everyone needs to be there." "You want to be there?" Eleanor Amara asked. "Oh, I will be there," I said, looking at the trash can where Mark's power of attorney papers lay among the used tissues. "He thinks he is inheriting a fortune. I want to be in the room when he finds out he is inheriting absolutely nothing." The morning of the meeting arrived with a heavy, grey stillness, the kind of weather that feels like the world is holding its breath. I sat on the edge of my bed at Cedar Grove, holding a single sheet of paper that was more valuable to me than any check I had ever written. It was my medical evaluation, signed by 2 independent neurologists and countersigned by the facility director, stating clearly that Eleanor Hartley was fully competent to live independently with minimal assistance. Amara had made 10 copies. I intended to make Mark eat every single one of them. Rosa had swapped her shift to drive me. She was not wearing her usual scrubs. Instead, she wore a sensible pair of slacks and a blazer. "I am not here as your nurse today, Mrs. Hartley," she said, handing me a cup of tea. "I am here because, well, I just really want to see their faces." I dressed with the precision of a soldier putting on armor. I bypassed the comfortable sweatpants and cardigans that had defined my life for the last few weeks. Instead, I pulled out a navy blue dress from the back of the closet, one I hadn't worn since the closing deal with Northpath. It was tailored, sharp, and commanded respect. I pulled on my low-heeled leather shoes and swept my hair up into a tight, disciplined bun. When I looked in the mirror, the frail patient from room 3B was gone. Staring back at me was the woman who had managed 300 employees and negotiated contracts with men who thought they could bully her. I leaned closer to the glass, studying the lines around my mouth. I whispered the words I had been saving. "No seat for you today." I tried it again, mimicking the exact pitch and dismissive tone Savannah had used at the restaurant. "No seat for you today, Savannah." A small, cold smile touched my lips. I wasn't saying it to hurt them. I was saying it to put the universe back in order. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a group message from Mark to the entire family, heading to the lawyer's office to wrap up some administrative details. "Mum, you just stay at Cedar Grove and rest. No need to stress yourself out with travel. I will represent you and handle everything. Love you." The audacity was breathtaking. He wasn't trying to save me from stress. He was trying to save himself from my presence. He wanted a rubber stamp, not a mother. I did not reply to the group. Instead, I scrolled to the number for Lily, my eldest granddaughter, who was home from college. She was the only one who had ever asked me about my business trips without asking for a souvenir. I typed a single message. "If you still want to hear the story of my life, come to Harlan's office today. But do not stand on anyone's side. Just stand on the side of the truth." Rosa drove us through the damp streets of Brookhaven. The rain from the previous night had left the pavement dark and slick. "You know," Rosa said, glancing at the overcast sky through the windshield, "this weather, it is very dramatic. It is like the beginning of a movie where the hero comes back from the dead." I let out a laugh, a genuine, sharp sound that surprised me. "Let's hope the ending is good." "Rosa." We pulled up to the glass-fronted office building where Harlan Pierce had his practice. From the safety of the car, I watched them arrive. Mark's SUV pulled up, and he stepped out, adjusting his tie. Savannah followed, wearing a dress that was appropriate for a funeral or a very somber bank transaction. A few other relatives' cousins who had not visited me in a decade were trailing behind them like hungry gulls following a fishing boat. They walked with the confident, loose-limbed stride of people who believe they have already won the lottery. They looked up at the building as if they owned it. They had no idea that the foundation of their future had already been demolished. I waited until they were inside the elevator. Then, I opened the car door. I grabbed my cane, not for support, but for emphasis. I took a deep breath of the cool, wet air. It smelled of rain and exhaust, the same scent that used to greet me at 4 a.m. when I started my cleaning shifts. "Ready?" Rosa asked, standing beside me. I was ready the moment they took my keys. I said. I slammed the car door shut and walked toward the entrance. I didn't feel like a grandmother fighting for scraps of dignity. I felt exactly the way I did 30 years ago when I walked into my first big client meeting terrified, exhilarated, and absolutely unwilling to take no for an answer. The heavy oak door to the conference room was thick, but it was not thick enough to block the sound of my son's voice. I stood in the hallway, my hand hovering over the brass handle, listening to Mark hold court. "Look, everyone knows Mom is fading," Mark was saying, his voice projecting a confident, sorrowful authority. "She is very weak. She barely understands day from night anymore. I am just stepping up to keep things tidy so we don't lose the assets to, administrative mismanagement." I pushed the door open. The hinges did not squeak. but the sudden movement sucked the air out of the room. Mark froze mid-gesture, his hand still raised as if he were conducting an orchestra. Around the long mahogany table sat Savannah, my cousins, and a few nieces, all of whom had been nodding solely along with Mark's speech. At the head of the table sat Harlan Pierce, holding a fountain pen. When he saw me standing there, flanked by Rosa in her blazer, Harlan dropped the pen. It clattered loudly against the wood. Mrs. Hartley. Harlan stammered, looking at me as if he were seeing a ghost that had crawled out of a grave he had already dug. I walked into the room, the tap of my cane on the parquet floor the only sound in the dead silence. I stopped a few feet from the table and offered a polite, chilly smile. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice steady and clear. I turned my gaze to Harlan. "I thought I should be present to hear the story you are telling about my life. Since, you know, it is actually my life." Savannah shrank into her chair, her face draining of colour. She looked from me to Mark, waiting for him to fix the glitch in their reality. Harlan cleared his throat, trying to regain his professional composure. He reached for a thick file folder in front of him. "Well, Eleanor, of course. We were just reviewing the transition plan Mark suggested given your medical condition. If you'll just take a seat, we can—" "That won't be necessary, Mr. Pierce." The voice came from the back corner of the room. Amara Delgado stood up from a chair where she had been sitting quietly in the shadows. She walked forward and placed her slim briefcase on the table. "I am Amara Delgado, Mrs. Hartley's retained counsel," she announced. "And that file you are holding is obsolete. All previous wills and powers of attorney have been revoked as of 48 hours ago." Mark's face turned a violent shade of red. He slammed his hand onto the table. "Who the hell are you?" he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Amara. "You are taking advantage of a sick, confused old woman. This is elder abuse. I will have you disbarred." Amara did not flinch. She calmly slid a document across the table toward Harlan. "This is a capacity evaluation conducted yesterday by 2 independent neurologists," Amara said. "It certifies that Mrs. Hartley is fully cogent, rational, and capable of managing her own affairs. We also have a recording of our client intake session, proving she directed every specific detail of the new estate plan." I stepped forward, looking directly at my son. "I am not confused, Mark. I am clearer than I have been in years." I shifted my gaze to Savannah. She refused to meet my eyes. "I remember everything," I said, pitching my voice so every relative in the room could hear. "I remember Easter Sunday. I remember arriving at the brunch I paid for, only to find you had given my seat to your friends. I remember you, Savannah, telling me, 'No seat for you today.' I remember being handed a $5 coffee voucher and told to go away so I wouldn't embarrass you." A gasp went around the room. My cousin barely suppressed a whisper of shock. "And I remember standing outside the window," I continued, "letting the words land like blows, listening to you tell your friends that in a few years you would split my $7.5 million and then you could invite whoever you wanted. That is a lie," Savannah shrieked, her voice cracking. "It was a joke. You have no sense of humour? We were just joking." Rosa stepped forward then. She didn't look like a subordinate. She looked like a judge. "Was it a joke when Mark called the nurses' station 3 times last week?" Rosa asked. He didn't ask about your health. He asked specifically how fast we could declare you incompetent so he could list the house on the market before the end of May. Mark opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The denial died in his throat because he knew it was true. Amara opened the new folder. Under the terms of the new Revocable Living Trust, the residence in Brookhaven, the investment portfolio, and all liquid assets are immediately transferred to the ownership of the Hartley Resilience Foundation. The room went deadly quiet. Mark and Savannah Hartley are not named as beneficiaries. Amara read, her voice devoid of emotion. A small educational trust has been established for Owen and Mia to be accessed only when they turn 25, independent of their parents. Mark looked like he had been punched in the gut. You can't do that. That's my money. I'm your son, Amara raised a hand to stop him. There is one more thing, she said, looking over her glasses at Mark. This trust contains a strict no-contest clause. If Mark or Savannah attempts to challenge Mrs. Hartley's capacity or the validity of this trust, or files any legal action whatsoever, the Children's Educational Trust is immediately forfeited and the funds are donated to the charity. The silence that followed was absolute. It shifted from the silence of shock to the silence of fear. Mark looked at me, his eyes wide with the realization that the trap he had built for me had just snapped shut around his own neck. Mark stood up so abruptly that his chair tipped backward, crashing against the hardwood floor with a deafening clatter. His face was a mask of twisted fury. But underneath the anger, I saw the tremor of a man watching his winning lottery ticket disintegrate in his hands. You are betraying this family, Mark shouted, his voice cracking. You are abandoning your own children and grandchildren. How can you be so selfish? I built my entire life plan around us taking care of you. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I looked him dead in the eye and asked the question that had been burning in my chest since Easter. When you said, "No seat for you today," to me, not just at the brunch, but in every decision you made for the last month, did you think I was a person in this family? Mark opened his mouth to argue, but the words died on his tongue. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Savannah tried a different tactic. She burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. Oh God, Eleanor, please. We were just scared. We thought you were losing your mind. We were just terrified you were being scammed by strangers. We went a little overboard, but it was out of love. I looked at her, unmoved by the performance. You were scared I was being scammed, I repeated flatly. Is that why you confiscated the keys to my own house? Is that why you tried to sell my roof while I was still sleeping under it? Savannah's sobbing stopped abruptly. She stared at the table, unable to answer. From the corner of the room, a quiet voice spoke up. It was Lily. My granddaughter stood up, her face pale. She did not look at her parents. She looked at me. I'm sorry, Grandma, Lily said softly. I didn't try to steal your money, but I let them treat you like you were invisible because it was easier for me. I didn't see you as an independent person. I just saw you as Grandma, and that was wrong. I nodded at her. It was the only apology in that room that held any weight. I turned my attention to the head of the table. Mr. Pierce, I said, my voice cutting like a knife. Please confirm for everyone in this room that I have the absolute legal right to change my counsel and my will, and please confirm that the plan Mark drafted was never signed. Harlan wiped sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Yes, he muttered, avoiding Mark's glare. Mrs. Hartley is within her rights. The previous plan was merely a proposal. I signaled to Amara and Rosa. We turned to leave. As we walked down the corridor toward the elevators, I heard running footsteps behind me. Mark grabbed my arm. His face was desperate now, the mask of the concerned son completely gone. Mum, wait, he pleaded, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. Look, we can fix this. You don't need a foundation. That's crazy. Just, at least give me a small portion. We can negotiate. We can keep this in the family. I have debts. Mom, I promised Savannah we would have the cash by summer. There it was, the naked truth. I pulled my arm from his grip. I straightened my jacket and looked at him with a calm detachment that felt like freedom. No seat for you today, I said. Mark blinked. What? From this moment on? I said, my voice steady. You do not have a default seat in my financial life. You are on your own. Mark, just like I was at 34? I turned to Lily, who was standing by the office door. Lily, if you want to help. The Hartley Resilience Foundation needs volunteers. There is no salary. There is no inheritance attached. But if you actually care about women who are treated like furniture, you are welcome to apply. I walked into the elevator and let the doors close on my son's stunned face. 2 months later, I sat in the front room of a small, converted bungalow on the edge of town. It was the new headquarters of the foundation. The walls were painted a warm yellow, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Rosa was at the desk opposite mine, reviewing a case file for a woman whose daughter had forged her signature on a deed. The phone on my desk rang. It was a new client. I picked up the receiver. I looked around the room at the space I had chosen, the work I had created, and the people I had selected to be near me. I wasn't a victim waiting for a handout. I wasn't a ghost in my own home. Hartley Resilience Foundation. Eleanor speaking. I said into the phone. I had finally pulled up my own chair to the table, and this time, no one was ever going to tell me where to sit. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to hear where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment down below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit the like button, and smash that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.